very first time I listened to an audiobook was back in 1973 when I was 17 years old. I was driving to Santa Monica Beach with my then girlfriend, Carrie. I had just bought a cheap paperback copy of Lobsang Rampa's The Hermit, which I found fascinating since it was steeped in Tibetan mysticism, though at the time I was under the mistaken impression it was non-fiction. I asked Carrie if she would read it to me as we drove. She turned out to be a good narrator, and right there and then, I envisaged a time when books would be easily available in audio format. Although there were talking books in the 1970s, they were prohibitively expensive, and one had to have a decent cassette player for them to work properly. Usually, one secured a copy from the library, and the selection was always hit and miss. It was also a hassle to make sure that tape was at the right mark, or that the previous borrower had rewound it correctly, or, worse yet, if the tape itself was damaged. Additionally, the sound recording was too often not up to par, and sometimes the narrator wasn't very good. Audiobooks started getting more popular in the early 1990s, and a number of stores opened up across the country offering new titles. For anyone with long driving commutes back and forth from home to work, audiobooks were a godsend. In my case, when I first got my professorship at Mount San Antonio College and was still living in Del Mar, I was driving nearly 4 hours a day and was usually stuck in traffic. So listening to classics such as Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment or Mom's The Razor's Edge was liberating. The key was to find a book that was more than 10 hours long. Tolstoy's Anna Karenina and War and Peace fit the bill perfectly, as they were 38 hours plus, depending on who was doing the narration. Around the same time, my brother Joseph, who worked for the Los Angeles Appeals Court, also had a terrible commute and found that listening to books on tape was a boredom savior. Though personally a pacifist, he was interested in war histories, particularly the Civil War and World War II. In this regard, I found Richard Rhodes' magisterial history, The Making of the Atomic Bomb, to be particularly riveting. With the advent of CDs, it made cassette tapes obsolete. However, their duration didn't last long once digital downloads were available over the internet. Yet, throughout these decades, the popularity of talking books was limited to only a few thousand titles. The market had not yet exploded. This changed with the advent of cell phones and portable music players, particularly the iPod, iPad, iPhone, and various Android devices. Amazon really upped the game when they bought and heavily promoted Audible.com. It became exceedingly easy to search for a book and then digitally download it within seconds. Long drives with heavy traffic actually became pleasant if the audiobook was compelling, such as Bill Bryson's A Short History of Nearly Everything or Walter Isaacson's remarkable biography of Albert Einstein. Between my brother Joseph and myself, we guesstimate that we have listened to well over 3,000 distinct audio titles. What we discovered in this process was that the narrator was elemental. No matter how good the book was, if the reader was bad, then one could proceed no further. Yet, and this surprised us a bit, you could have a fairly awful book, but if the narrator was exquisite, then one could slog through to the end. This is similar perhaps to movies. A terrible soundtrack can ruin what otherwise would be a classic film. George Lucas of Star Wars fame realized this earlier on in the 1970s and emphasized that a proper sound system was fundamental for watching and listening to movies. In this regard, some narrators were so good that we could probably listen to them reading from a telephone book. From my extended experience in this area, a few audio readers stand out amongst the rest. My all-star lineup includes Edward Herman, Einstein, His Life and Universe, George Guidall, Jorge Luis Borges' Collected Fictions, Simon Vance, The Club, Johnson, Boswell, and the Friends Who Shaped an Age, David Horowitz, Leo Tolstoy's Anna Karenina, Frederick Davidson, George Orwell's Down and Out in Paris and London, Richard Matthews, Bill Bryson's A Short History of Nearly Everything, and unexpectedly, at least to me, Will Wheaton, Ernest Cline's Ready Player One. There are many more readers that are excellent, but truth be told, there are also a truckload of awful narrators, and they can, far too easily, ruin any book, classic or otherwise. The late Toni Morrison is quoted as saying, "If there's a book that you want to read, but it hasn't been written yet, then you must write it." I thought about this and similar quotes about 4 years back when I got frustrated looking for an audio version of a book, only to discover that there was none. This got me to thinking, why not produce your own? To my joy, I found out that there were literally tens of thousands of professional readers anxious for the opportunity to narrate a book. I wasn't quite sure how ACX, Audiobook Creation Exchange, worked. It was owned and operated by Audible.com, which, in turn, had been purchased by Amazon. I soon learned that it was much easier to produce an audiobook than I ever imagined. Essentially, once a book is published, it can qualify for an audio edition. What the publisher does is put the book up for auditions and then select the right narrator for the job. Ever since I had co-founded the MSAC philosophy group with Dr. Stefan Ronbaum, the then Dean of Humanities at Mount San Antonio College back in 1990, we had published well over 175 unique titles. None of them had audio versions. I decided there and then to put 2 books immediately up on ACX for auditions, both of which were authored by my wife, Andrea Diem-Lane, who was also, like myself, a professor of philosophy. She had written a short introduction to Sikhism, The Sikhs, a brief introduction, and we were fortunate to have Clay Lomokayu do the narration. It was actually a strange coincidence that he chose our book, since just the week prior I was listening to Lobsang Rampa's Cave of the Ancients, which had just been released on Audible, and it was Clay Lomokayu who did the narration. He has a unique voice and presentation. Not only has he narrated most of Rampa's books, including his best-known title, The Third Eye, but the very first book that my high school girlfriend read to me while driving in the car to go surfing back in the early 1970s, The Hermit. Luckily, we got Lomokayu to do several other books for the MSAC philosophy group, including The Bengali Mystic, 88 Insights from Sri Ramakrishna, Ecstatic Memory, A Glimpse of Rumi, The Blissful Longing of Rumi, and Mystics of Islam. The second book we put up by my wife was Quantum Weirdness, Einstein versus Bohr. Again, we got fortunate to secure a good reader named Cliff Truesdell, who later did my own book, The Enchanted Land, with the Mystics of India. One of the chief motivating reasons for why I and others at the MSAC philosophy group have invested so much time and energy into audiobooks is that it helps our college students who have benefited from alternative formats to learn new material. Presently, we have produced 150 books that are available on Amazon, Audible, and Apple's iTunes. We have also made certain to have free PDF versions of every book we have published. Our hope is to reach the 200 mark by the end of 2020. I often tell my students that in an age where everyone is distracted by too much information, too much social media, and too many new gadgets, it is important to find ways to focus our attention. Listening to audiobooks is in some way a throwback to our ancestral past, where we would sit around a campfire and listen to our elders tell stories about their own lives or the lives of those who came before them. It is ironic that futuristic technologies can allow us to go back to our historical roots and perform that most primordial of tasks, the art of listening.